Hey folks, before the video starts, please leave a like and subscribe to cheer me up. Make sure you are relaxed and enjoy today's stories. I sold my hair to a celebrity on the deep web. He is now immortal, so I've never been the type to mess around with the dark corners of the internet. But sometimes curiosity gets the best of you, you know? It all started when I was scrolling through some conspiracy forums late one night. You know the type. Guys with tinfoil hats debating about whether the government is run by lizard people. Most of it was good for a laugh, but one thread caught my eye. It was called Immortality and the Deep Web. I'm not an idiot. I know the deep web is no place for someone who values their sanity or safety. But the thread was strangely compelling, and the way the original poster described it made it seem like more than just a joke. According to them, there was a site, buried deep in the web's most obscure corners, where you could buy and sell, well, yourself. The details were vague, but the concept was something about trading parts of yourself in exchange for money or favors from people who shouldn't even exist. At first, I thought it was just some elaborate ARG or creepypasta, but then a bunch of replies popped up from people claiming they'd made deals and walked away with life-changing money, or in some cases, something more sinister. There were accounts of people who had sold their fingernails, skin samples, even blood, to faceless buyers who supposedly used them for God knows what. Something about it just felt different. It didn't have that usual try-hard vibe you get from fake horror stories. These people were serious, or at least they thought they were. Out of a morbid sense of curiosity and a bit of financial desperation, to be honest, I decided to dig deeper. I was working a dead-end job at the time, barely scraping by, and the idea of making a quick buck, no matter how weird, was tempting. So, I followed the breadcrumbs, trying to find this so-called marketplace. It wasn't easy. I'm talking hours of searching through cryptic forums, piecing together fragments of information like some twisted puzzle. Most of the links were dead ends, literally, like they'd lead to nothing but a blank page, or worse, those sketchy sites that set off every alarm on your antivirus. I was about to give up when I finally hit something. The site had no name, just a black screen with a single line of text. What are you willing to give? Below it, there was a list of options: hair, nails, blood, teeth, skin, organs, and some other things that made my stomach churn. The payout for each was listed in Bitcoin, and the amounts were absurd. Hair alone could get you a few $1,000s depending on the length and quality. Now, I don't consider myself particularly superstitious, but something about the whole setup made me feel like I was stepping into territory I wasn't supposed to. But again, money. Desperation does funny things to your sense of caution. I had pretty long hair at the time, almost down to my waist. It wasn't anything special, but it was healthy, and I figured if I was going to do this, I'd go for the easiest option. I clicked on the hair option, and the screen refreshed to display a list of buyers. Most of the usernames were just strings of random characters, but one caught my eye. 1NF1N1 tie. Something about that name gave me chills, but I clicked on it anyway. The profile was sparse, just a brief description that read, "Seeking longevity through non-traditional means. Will pay top Bitcoin for authentic material." There was no picture, no other information, just a buy now button next to a staggering offer of 2 Bitcoin for 100 grams of hair. Now, I'm no crypto expert, but even I knew that 2 Bitcoin was a lot of money, more than enough to cover my rent and then some. And for what? A few inches of hair. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to back out, but I was too far in at this point. I clicked buy now before I could second guess myself. The next screen was a simple input form asking for my shipping information and a few other details. I filled it out, feeling like I was signing some kind of Faustian pact, and hit submit. The confirmation message was brief. Your buyer will be in contact soon. I stared at the screen, waiting for something to happen, but nothing did. After a few minutes, I shut my laptop and tried to shake off the unease that was creeping up my spine. It was probably just some rich weirdo with a hair fetish, I told myself. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I woke up to an email with a subject line that read, Your transaction is complete. The body of the email had a tracking number and a short note. Please send the package to the attached address within 48 hours. Your payment will be processed upon confirmation of delivery. The address was somewhere in Los Angeles, in one of those ritzy neighborhoods where celebrities live. That gave me pause, but I figured maybe this one NF1 N1 Thai guy was just some eccentric millionaire. I mean, it made sense, right? Who else would spend thousands of dollars on hair? I packed up the hair, which I'd chopped off in a moment of steely resolve, and sent it off, hoping that this wasn't the stupidest thing I'd ever done. Little did I know, I'd just opened the door to something far darker than I could have ever imagined. The days after I sent off the package were a weird blur of anxiety and anticipation. I kept checking the tracking number obsessively, watching as the package made its way across the country. Each time it got closer to Los Angeles, my stomach twisted a little tighter. I was half expecting it to get lost or for something to go wrong, but it arrived at its destination without a hitch. A couple of hours later, I got another email. This time, it wasn't just a cold confirmation message. It was directly from one NF1 N1 Thai. The subject line simply read, Thank you. The email itself was brief. Payment has been processed. Pleasure doing business with you. Expect further contact. That last line threw me off. Further contact? What more could this guy possibly want? I figured it was just some formal sign-off, but it still made me uneasy. Sure enough though, when I checked my Bitcoin wallet, the 2 Bitcoin were there. At the time, that was enough to cover my rent for a year. Easy. I should have been ecstatic, but instead I felt this creeping sense of dread, like I'd just done something really, really stupid, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. I tried to brush it off. I mean, it was done. Right. The transaction was over, and I had the money. I told myself I'd just lay low for a while, stay off those shady forums, and forget the whole thing ever happened. But the universe has a way of not letting you off that easy. About a week later, I was sitting at home, trying to enjoy a quiet evening. I had almost managed to convince myself that everything was normal again, that I'd gotten away with my weird little adventure without any real consequences. That's when my phone rang. The number was blocked. I hesitated before answering, but something in the back of my mind was telling me to pick up. Maybe it was the curiosity again, or maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I wasn't scared. I answered with a shaky, "Hello?" There was silence on the other end, followed by a low, distorted voice that sent a chill straight down my spine. It wasn't robotic exactly, but it had this strange, unnatural quality to it, like it was being run through some kind of filter. The voice said, Thank you for your contribution. I froze, my mind racing. Who is this? I managed to stammer out, even though I already knew the answer. Your hair, the voice continued, ignoring my question. It's perfect. You've helped me more than you could possibly imagine. My heart was pounding in my chest. This wasn't just some rich guy with a hair fetish. This was something else, something I couldn't quite grasp, and it terrified me. Listen, I don't know who you are or what you want, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But the deal's done. You got what you paid for, and I'm out. The voice let out a low, distorted laugh that made my skin crawl. You're out? Oh no, my friend, you're very much in. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at my phone, my hand shaking. What the hell had I gotten myself into? I didn't sleep much that night. Every little noise in my apartment set me on edge, like I was waiting for something or someone to show up at my door. But the night passed without incident, and by morning, I was half convinced that the phone call had just been some kind of sick prank. Maybe some hacker had gotten into the deep web transaction and decided to mess with me. That seemed like the most logical explanation, but the uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. It sat in the pit of my stomach, gnawing at me, and no matter what I did, I couldn't shake it. I kept thinking about that last thing the voice had said. You're very much in. In what? What did that even mean? The answer came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, I was at work, trying to focus on my mind-numbing tasks, when my phone buzzed with a new notification. I glanced at it, expecting the usual spam or a text from a friend, but what I saw made my blood run cold. It was another email from one NF1N1 Thai. The subject line read, "A gift." I didn't want to open it. I knew that whatever was inside was going to drag me further into this nightmare, but I couldn't help myself. My hands were trembling as I tapped the notification, and the email opened to reveal a single attachment, a video file. My first instinct was to delete it. Whatever was on that video, I didn't want to see it. But again, curiosity, maybe even a twisted sense of obligation, got the better of me. I downloaded the file, took a deep breath, and hit play. The video was grainy, like it had been recorded on an old VHS camera. The first thing I saw was a dimly lit room, empty except for a single chair in the center. It was one of those old wooden chairs you'd see in a schoolhouse, with a worn seat and slightly crooked legs. For a moment, nothing happened. The camera just lingered on that chair, as if it were waiting for something. Then the door at the far end of the room creaked open, and a figure stepped into view. My heart skipped a beat as I recognized him, or at least I thought I did. It was a man, tall and lean, with slicked back hair and a face that was strangely familiar. But there was something off about him, something I couldn't quite place. He moved with an unnatural grace, like every movement was pre-planned, rehearsed. He walked over to the chair and sat down, staring straight into the camera. That's when I realized where I'd seen him before, on TV. He was a celebrity, one of those A-list actors who seemed to be everywhere for a while, and then faded into obscurity. But that wasn't the disturbing part. The disturbing part was that he looked exactly the same as he had years ago, as if he hadn't aged a day. He smiled, and there was something eerie about it, something that made me want to look away. Then he spoke, and my blood turned to ice. "Thank you," he said, his voice smooth and polished, nothing like the distorted voice from the phone call. "You've given me a new lease on life. Your hair, it's more powerful than you know." I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, what I was hearing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of sick joke, some elaborate hoax. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. This was real. This was happening. The man in the video leaned closer to the camera, his smile widening. "I'm not done with you yet," he said. "There's so much more we can do together." The video cut out, leaving me staring at a black screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. I was in way over my head, tangled up in something I couldn't understand, something that was far from over. And that's when I knew, without a doubt, that the nightmare was just beginning. I didn't leave my apartment for days after watching that video. I called in sick to work, ignored my friends' texts, and basically holed up in my room, trying to make sense of what was happening. The world outside my walls felt distant, almost unreal, like it belonged to someone else. I was too terrified to tell anyone what was going on. Not that I thought anyone would believe me. I mean, how do you explain that a washed-up celebrity is somehow immortal and connected to you through a deal you made on the deep web? The worst part was that I couldn't stop thinking about that last thing he said in the video. "I'm not done with you yet." It played over and over in my mind like a broken record, each time filling me with the deepest sense of dread. I kept expecting him to show up at my door, or for another mysterious package to arrive. But days passed and nothing happened, just silence. Eventually, the fear started to dull, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that something worse was coming. My instincts were right. One night, when the city was unusually quiet, I woke up to the sound of my phone buzzing on the nightstand. I checked the time, 2:17 a.m. My heart dropped when I saw the notification. Another email from one NF1 in one tie, but this time the subject line read, "A visit." My fingers trembled as I opened the email. There was no text, just a single attachment, a photo. I hesitated before tapping on it, knowing deep down that whatever was in that photo would push me further into this nightmare. But I couldn't help myself. I had to see. So, with a shaky breath, I tapped on the attachment. The image that filled my screen was dark and blurry at first, but as my eyes adjusted, I felt my blood run cold. It was a picture of my apartment building, taken from across the street. The photo was recent. I could tell by the faint light still on in my living room window, the same light I had turned off before going to bed. Someone had been watching me. Panic gripped me, and I scrambled out of bed, rushing to the window to look outside. The street below was deserted, eerily still in the dim glow of the streetlights. No one was there, at least not anymore, but the sense of being watched was overwhelming, like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I spent the hours until dawn pacing my apartment, checking the locks on my door and windows over and over again. But no matter how many times I reassured myself that everything was secure, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. As the sun finally crept over the horizon, I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I had to get out, clear my head, and try to figure out what to do next. I grabbed my keys, threw on some clothes, and bolted out the door. I didn't have a plan. I just started walking. The city was waking up around me, people going about their morning routines, completely unaware that my world was unraveling. I wandered aimlessly, trying to calm my racing thoughts, but nothing helped. Every face in the crowd looked suspicious, every shadow a potential potential threat. After a couple of hours, I found myself in a part of the city I didn't recognize. It was a quiet neighborhood, with old houses lined up along tree-shaded streets. I hadn't meant to come here, but something about the place felt oddly calming. Maybe it was just the contrast to the chaos in my mind, but I decided to stop and sit on a bench near a small park. As I sat there, trying to gather my thoughts, my phone buzzed again. Dread flooded my system as I pulled it out of my pocket, half expecting another email. But it wasn't an email this time. It was a text message. The number was blocked. The message was simple. Just a single word. Look. My heart skipped a beat as I glanced around, my eyes darting from one side of the park to the other. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary at first. Just a few people walking their dogs, kids playing in the distance. But then I saw him, sitting on a bench across from me, partially hidden by the shadows of a large oak tree, was the man from the video, the celebrity. He looked exactly as he had in the video, unnervingly untouched by time, with that same unsettling smile on his face. Our eyes met, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just sat there, watching me. For a moment, I thought about running, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I was trapped in place, paralyzed by fear. Finally, he stood up, and my body tensed, ready to bolt. But he didn't come toward me. Instead, he turned and walked away, disappearing down a side street without so much as a backward glance. I didn't follow him. I couldn't. I was too terrified to do anything but sit there, my mind racing with questions. What did he want from me? Why was he following me? And most importantly, how was any of this possible? After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to get up and head back to my apartment. I needed to regroup, figure out my next move. But as I walked back, something caught my eye. A small piece of paper tucked under the windshield wiper of a parked car. Curiosity got the better of me, and I reached out to grab it. The note was short, written in neat, almost elegant handwriting. You're not alone. Meet me at the old library. Midnight. There was no signature, no indication of who it was from, but something told me it wasn't from 1NF1N1 tie. This felt different, like a lifeline being thrown into the dark abyss I'd found myself in. I didn't know if I could trust it, but at this point, I didn't have much of a choice. I needed answers, and if there was even a chance that someone out there knew what was happening to me, I had to take it. As the day dragged on, I tried to prepare myself for whatever might happen at the library. My mind kept replaying the events of the past few weeks, searching for clues, trying to piece together the puzzle of how my life had spiraled so far out of control. But nothing made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized just how deep I was in. By the time night fell, I was on edge, every nerve in my body wound tight. I grabbed my jacket, tucked a small pocket knife into my pocket, more for my own peace of mind than anything, and headed out the door. The old library was on the edge of town, a relic from another time that had long since fallen into disrepair. The city had been talking about tearing it down for years, but for some reason it still stood, forgotten by most, except for the occasional urban explorer or thrill seeker. When I arrived, the place was deserted. As expected, the windows were boarded up, and the once grand entrance was covered in graffiti and overgrown vines. A shiver ran down my spine as I approached, but I pushed it aside and stepped inside, my footsteps echoing eerily in the empty space. The interior was just as abandoned as the outside. Dust-covered shelves, broken furniture, and the faint smell of decay hanging in the air. I made my way through the maze of rooms, my heart pounding in my chest, until I reached the main reading hall, and that's when I saw her. A woman was standing in the center of the room, her back to me. She was tall, with long dark hair that cascaded down her back, wearing a black coat that almost blended into the shadows. She turned as I approached, and I saw that she was older, maybe in her late 40s, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to look right through me. "You're the one who made the deal," she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of urgency. I nodded, too stunned to speak. "I don't have much time," she continued, glancing around as if expecting someone or something to interrupt. "But you need to understand this. One NF1 and one tie isn't what he seems. He's not just some guy looking for a quick fix. He's been alive for centuries, feeding off people like you to keep himself going." My mind reeled as I tried to process what she was saying. Centuries? Feeding off people? It sounded insane, but given everything I'd experienced, I couldn't dismiss it out of hand. "What does he want with me?" I finally managed to ask. She sighed, her expression softening for a moment. "He's chosen you as his next source. You've already given him a piece of yourself, but it's not enough. He needs more, and he won't stop until he gets it." A cold wave of fear washed over me. "How do I stop him?" She hesitated, as if weighing her words carefully. "There's only one way to end this. You have to destroy the connection. Burn the hair you sold him. But it won't be easy. He'll try to stop you, and once the connection is broken, he'll be vulnerable. That's when you'll need to act." "Act? How?" I asked, dread creeping into my voice. "Once he's weakened, you have to end him," she said, her voice steely. "Completely. It's the only way to free yourself, and anyone else, he's bound to this curse." Before I could ask anything else, she reached into her coat and handed me a small vial of liquid. "This will help. When the time comes, you'll know what to do." The sound of footsteps echoed through the hall, and she stiffened, glancing toward the entrance. "He's here," she whispered. "Go now. You don't have much time." I didn't need to be told twice. I turned and bolted out of the library, my mind racing with what I'd just learned. The wind whipped through the streets as I ran, and I could feel the weight of the vial in my pocket, a reminder of what I had to do. I wasn't sure if I could go through with it, if I could really face down something as ancient and powerful as one NF1 one tie. But one thing was clear. The game had changed, and my life, and possibly many others, depended on what I did next. I spent the next few days in a state of constant paranoia. Every creak of my apartment, every flicker of a shadow, sent my heart racing. I knew one NF1 and one tie was still out there, watching, waiting for me to make my move. The woman from the library had given me a way out, but the thought of what I had to do filled me with a cold dread that I couldn't shake. I kept the vial she had given me close at all times, tucked safely into the inner pocket of my jacket. I didn't know exactly what it was, but I trusted her, if only because I didn't have any other choice. Whatever was in that vial, it was supposed to be the key to ending this nightmare. The problem was, I didn't know where to start. The woman had said I needed to burn the hair I sold, but that was easier said than done. I had no idea where it was or how to get it back. And then there was the bigger issue. One NF1 and one tie wasn't going to just let me waltz in and take it. I was sure of that. One night, as I sat in my apartment trying to figure out my next move, I heard a knock at the door. My blood ran cold. No one ever came to visit me. especially not unannounced. I approached the door cautiously, heart pounding in my chest. "Who is it?" I called out, my voice shaking more than I'd like to admit. There was a brief pause before a familiar voice replied, "It's me." I recognized her voice immediately, the woman from the library. Relief washed over me as I quickly unlocked the door and let her in. She stepped inside, her expression serious, and closed the door behind her. "I've been keeping an eye on him," she said without preamble. "He's getting impatient. Whatever he's planning, it's going to happen soon." "Did you find the hair?" I asked, desperate for some good news. She nodded. "Yes, but it's not going to be easy. He's keeping it close, at his estate in the hills. Security is tight, and he's always watching, but I know a way in." Her words sent a jolt of fear and determination through me. I didn't have time to second-guess myself anymore. This was it, the only chance I had to end this. "When do we go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Tonight," she said, her tone brooking no argument. "The longer we wait, the more dangerous it becomes. We have to catch him off guard." I swallowed hard and nodded. There was no turning back now. The drive to 1 NF1 and 1 Ty's estate felt surreal, like I was moving through a fog. The city lights blurred past the window as we ascended into the hills, the landscape growing darker and more remote with each mile. The woman, who still hadn't given me her name, drove in silence, her face set in grim determination. Finally, we reached a gated entrance, hidden by thick trees. The estate beyond was massive, a sprawling mansion that seemed to loom out of the darkness like some ancient fortress. The gates were locked tight, but the woman led me to a side path that wound through the trees and up to a back entrance. "This way," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rustling of the wind in the leaves. "Stay close and keep quiet." We slipped through the shadows, every step feeling like it was taking us deeper into the belly of the beast. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my ears. The mansion was dark, only a few dim lights visible through the windows, but I could sense that we weren't alone. She led me to a small door near the back of the estate, which she managed to unlock with a slim tool pulled from her coat. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow hallway that led into the heart of the mansion. The place smelled of old wood and something else, something sickly sweet that made my stomach churn. We moved quickly, but cautiously, the woman leading the way through a labyrinth of hallways and rooms. The mansion was eerily quiet, the only sound our soft footsteps on the carpeted floors. Finally, we reached a large, ornate door that seemed out of place in the otherwise modern mansion. "This is it," she whispered, her hand resting on the door handle. "He's keeping it in here. Be ready for anything." I nodded, clutching the vial in my pocket like a lifeline. She pushed the door open, and we stepped inside. The room beyond was dimly lit by a single flickering candle on a massive oak desk. The walls were lined with shelves filled with old books and strange artifacts, and the air was thick with the smell of burning incense. But what caught my attention immediately was the glass case in the center of the room. Inside, nestled on a black velvet cushion, was a lock of hair. My hair. I felt a wave of nausea as I stared at it. The reality of what I had done, of what I had sold, hit me like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just hair. It was a piece of me, and now it was in the hands of something far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. The woman moved quickly, pulling out a small vial of her own and sprinkling its contents over the glass case. The liquid hissed as it made contact, and the glass began to dissolve like acid. Within seconds, The case was gone, leaving the hair exposed. "Do it," she urged, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting one NF1 and one tie to burst in at any moment. With shaking hands, I pulled out the vial she had given me and poured its contents onto the hair. The liquid soaked into the strands, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then the hair began to smolder, curling up on itself as if it were burning from the inside out. The smell of charred hair filled the room, and I watched in both horror and relief as the lock of hair was consumed by invisible flames. As the last of the hair disintegrated, a low guttural scream echoed through the mansion. It was a sound of pure agony, inhuman and terrifying, like the wail of something ancient being torn apart. "He's weakened," the woman said, her voice urgent. "Now we end this." Before I could respond, the door to the room slammed open with a force that rattled the walls. One NF1 and one tie stood in the doorway, his face twisted in rage. He looked different now. His skin was pale and waxy, almost translucent, and his eyes burned with a hatred that made my blood run cold. "You!" he snarled, his voice no longer smooth and charming, but filled with venom. "You dare to defy me?" The woman didn't hesitate. She pulled out a small dagger from her coat, its blade glinting in the candlelight. "You've fed off others for too long," she said, stepping between one NF1 and one tie and me. "It ends tonight." One NF1 and one tie let out a growl that shook the room and lunged at her with a speed that was almost inhuman, but she was faster, sidestepping his attack and plunging the dagger into his chest. He let out a horrible, blood-curdling scream as the blade sank in, his body convulsing violently. For a moment, I thought it was over, but then one NF1 and one tie reached up and grabbed the woman by the throat, lifting her off the ground with a strength that belied his frail appearance. She struggled, gasping for breath, but he held on, his face twisted in a cruel smile. "Foolish woman," he spat. "You think you can kill me? I am eternal." In a panic, I looked around for anything that could help. My eyes landed on the candle on the desk, still flickering weakly in the chaos. Without thinking, I grabbed it and hurled it at one NF1 and one tie. The candle struck his arm, and the flames caught onto his clothing, spreading rapidly across his body. He let out a roar of pain, dropping the woman as he tried to extinguish the flames. But it was too late. The fire spread quickly, consuming him as he writhed and screamed. The room filled with the acrid smell of burning flesh, and I backed away, horrified by the sight before me. The woman collapsed to the ground, gasping for air, but alive. One NF1 and one tie's screams grew weaker, his movements slowing as the fire consumed him. Finally, with one last shuddering breath, he collapsed to the floor, his body reduced to a smoldering heap of ash and charred remains. Silence fell over the room, broken only by the crackling of the dying flames. The woman slowly got to her feet, clutching her throat, but otherwise unharmed. "It's over," she said, her voice hoarse but filled with relief. "He's gone." I stared at the pile of ashes that had once been one NF1 and one tie, hardly able to believe it. It was finally over, but as the woman turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still wrong. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with a sense of unease that wouldn't go away. And then I saw it, a small glowing ember in a pile of ashes. Before I could react, it flared up, igniting with a sudden intensity that sent a shock of fear through me. The ember quickly grew, forming a small writhing flame that began to take shape. It was as if the fire was reconstructing itself, building something from the ashes. The woman noticed it too and turned back, her eyes wide with horror. "No, it can't be," she whispered, more to herself than to me. But it was happening. Before her eyes, the fire twisted and grew, forming into a vaguely human shape, the flames licking up into the air, growing taller and more solid. The room filled with the stench of burning, a sickening smell that made my stomach churn. One NF1 and one tie was coming back. "We have to go," the woman shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me toward the door. But even as she said it, I knew we were too late. The fire had fully formed into a figure, a humanoid shape blazing with an unnatural light, its eyes glowing like hot coals. It didn't look like one NF1, one tie anymore, at least not in the way I had seen him before. This was something else, something twisted and monstrous. The fire flickered and hissed, its form unstable, as if struggling to hold itself together. "You can't escape," the creature that had once been one NF1 and one tie rasped, its voice crackling like dry wood in a bonfire. "I am eternal. I will never die." The woman looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "We have to end this now, once and for all." I nodded, though I had no idea what we could possibly do to stop this thing. The vial was empty, the hair destroyed, and yet one NF1 and one tie was still here, somehow more powerful than before. The creature took a step towards us, its fiery form casting long, flickering shadows across the room. The heat was unbearable, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my face, but I stood my ground, refusing to let fear control me. The woman reached into her coat once more, pulling out a small leather-bound book. "This is ancient magic," she said, flipping through the pages with trembling hands. "It's a last resort, but it's our only chance." She began to chant something in a language I didn't understand, her voice steady despite the growing panic in her eyes. The flames around one NF1 and one tie seemed to react to her words, flickering wildly as if in pain. The creature let out a furious guttural roar, and the room shook as if an earthquake had struck. But the woman didn't stop. She continued to chant, her voice rising in intensity as she held the book high. The flames around one NF1 and one tie began to pull inward, as if being sucked into the book itself. The creature's form wavered, struggling against whatever force the woman was unleashing. I watched in awe as the firestorm that had been one NF1 and one tie shrank, drawn toward the book as if by some invisible magnet. The creature screamed in fury, thrashing against the pull, but it was no use. The fire swirled around the book, shrinking smaller and smaller, until finally, with a loud crack, the flames were gone, leaving the room eerily silent. The woman collapsed to her knees, clutching the book tightly as if it was the only thing keeping her grounded. I rushed to her side, helping her up as she took deep, ragged breaths. Did we do it?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. She nodded weakly. "I've sealed him away. He's trapped, but only for now." Her words sent a chill down my spine. "What do you mean, only for now?" "This kind of magic can't hold him forever," she explained, her voice barely above a whisper. "He's too powerful, too ancient. Eventually, he'll break free again." "Then what do we do?" I asked, panic rising in my chest once more. "How do we stop him for good?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with a sorrow that I hadn't seen before. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we've bought ourselves some time. That's all we can do for now." It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only one I was going to get. The woman turned to leave, clutching the book to her chest, as if it was the most precious thing in the world. "What happens now?" I asked, following her to the door. "You go back to your life," she said, her tone weary. "But stay vigilant. He may be gone for now, but the dark web is full of things like him, things that should never have been unleashed. Don't ever go back there. No matter how desperate you get, don't make the same mistake twice." I nodded, unable to find any words. As we stepped out into the night, the cool air hit my face like a wake-up call, reminding me that I was still alive, still here. The woman turned to me. "One last time. If he comes back, you'll know. And when that time comes, find me. I'll be ready." With that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing alone outside the mansion that had been the source of my nightmares. The ride home was a blur. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. I didn't know if I would ever truly feel safe again, but for now, the threat was over. One NF1 and one T was gone, sealed away in some ancient forbidden magic. The knowledge that it wasn't permanent, that one day he might return, lingered like a dark cloud over my thoughts. When I finally reached my apartment, I collapsed onto the bed, utterly exhausted. Sleep came quickly, but it was restless, filled with dreams of fire and shadows. And as I drifted off, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The days that followed felt like a fragile calm after a storm. I went back to my routine, trying to convince myself that things were normal again, but deep down, I knew that I was just biding my time. The memory of that night at the mansion, of one NF1 and one Ty's fiery form, and the woman's desperate spell, lingered like a stain in my mind. I threw myself into work, into mundane tasks, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter how hard I tried to forget, there was always a gnawing sense of unease in the back of my mind, a whisper that said it wasn't really over. Every night I would lock my doors, double-check the windows, and lie in bed staring at the ceiling, waiting for the other shoe to drop. It didn't take long. About a week after the events at the mansion, I started noticing strange things around my apartment. At first, they were small, objects slightly out of place, lights flickering for no reason, the odd feeling of being watched. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was still shaken up from everything that had happened, but deep down, I knew better. Then the dreams started. Every night, I would wake up drenched in sweat, the same nightmare playing over and over in my mind. I was back in the mansion, the flames closing in around me, but this time the woman wasn't there. I was alone, trapped as one NF1 and one Ty's fiery form loomed closer, his eyes burning with an endless hunger. One night, I woke up from one of those dreams to find that I wasn't alone. My room was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw it. A figure standing at the foot of my bed, shrouded in shadow. My heart leapt into my throat, and I scrambled to turn on the lamp on my nightstand. The light flickered on, casting a warm glow over the room, but the figure was gone. I was alone again, the shadows retreating to their corners. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the dream had shaken me up, and I was seeing things, but the fear was real, the pounding of my heart, a reminder that something was terribly wrong. The next day, I found a message scratched into the wall by my bed. The words were rough, jagged, as if carved by something sharp and unforgiving. I am not finished. Panic gripped me as I stared at the words, my mind racing. I knew then that the woman's spell hadn't been enough. That one NF1N1 tie was still out there, still connected to me somehow. The thought of facing him again, of trying to survive whatever he had planned, was almost too much to bear. But I couldn't just sit there and wait for him to come for me. I had to do something, anything, to protect myself. I needed to find the woman, the one who had helped me before, and see if there was anything else we could do to end this once and for all. I spent the next few days searching for her, visiting the old library and every other place I thought she might be, but she was gone, vanished without a trace. It was as if she had never existed, leaving me to face this nightmare on my own. The days blurred together, each one filled with a growing sense of dread. The messages on my wall multiplied, each one more disturbing than the last. You cannot escape. I will find you. We are bound. The words seemed to pulse with a life of their own, taunting me, reminding me that my time was running out. I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. I packed a bag with the essentials, grabbed the vial that had once held the liquid I used to destroy the hair, and left, not knowing where I was going or what I would do next. I just knew I had to get away, as far away from that place as possible. But as I drove through the city, the streets felt foreign, twisted, like I was moving through a world that wasn't my own. The familiar landmarks seemed distorted, warped in ways I couldn't quite describe. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with every passing mile, and I realized with a sinking dread that there was no escaping this. Infinity was with me wherever I went. Desperation took hold, and I drove out of the city, heading for the countryside, hoping that the distance would somehow weaken his hold on me. But the further I went, the worse it got. The shadows in the corners of my vision grew darker, more solid, until I could almost make out shapes moving within them. I was losing my grip, and I knew it. As night fell, I found myself on a deserted road, the dark forest on either side closing in like a suffocating blanket. I couldn't stay on the road much longer. I needed to find somewhere safe to stop, to think. But as I rounded a bend, the car's headlights illuminated something that made my blood run cold. It was the mansion. Somehow, impossibly, I had driven right back to the place where this nightmare had begun. The grand, foreboding structure loomed out of the darkness, its windows dark and lifeless. But I knew better. This place was anything but lifeless. A part of me wanted to turn around, to flee as far away as I could, but something stronger pulled me toward the mansion, an inexplicable force that I couldn't resist. I parked the car and stepped out, the night air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. As I approached the mansion, the front door creaked open on its own, as if inviting me inside. I hesitated, but only for a moment, before stepping over the threshold. The interior was just as I remembered, dark, cold, and filled with an oppressive sense of dread. But this time, there was something different. A low, thrumming sound filled the air, like the beating of a distant drum, and the shadows on the walls seemed to pulse in time with it. I followed the sound, my footsteps echoing hollowly through the empty halls. It led me back to the room where I had first destroyed the hair, where one NF1N1 tie had almost killed us. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside, the room was dimly lit by a single flickering candle on the desk. The glass case was gone, replaced by a small ornate box that sat in the center of the desk, surrounded by a circle of strange symbols etched into the wood. I approached the box cautiously, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. I had to see what was inside. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid of the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of black velvet, was a lock of hair. My hair, whole and unburned, as if nothing had ever happened to it. A wave of horror and realization washed over me. The connection hadn't been broken at all. It had been reforged, stronger than ever, and now one NF1 and one tie was more powerful than before. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing the candle and plunging me into darkness. And then I heard it, a voice, low and filled with malice, echoing from the shadows. "You thought you could escape me," it whispered, the sound sending a chill down my spine. "But you belong to me now. Forever." I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me inside. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in as the darkness thickened, swallowing the light. And then I saw him, stepping out of the shadows, his form no longer human, but something twisted and monstrous. Flames licked at his edges, and his eyes burned with a malevolent fire. "There's no running," he said, his voice filling the room. "No hiding. We are bound, and you will serve me for eternity." I backed away, my mind racing, searching for any way out. But there was nothing. No escape. No hope. Just the cold, crushing reality that I had sealed my fate the moment I made that deal on the deep web. As one NF1 and one tie advanced on me, his twisted form filling my vision, I knew there was nothing left to do but surrender. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me was his burning eyes, filled with an endless hungry fire. And then there was nothing. They found my car the next morning, abandoned on the side of the road, the engine still running, but I was gone, vanished without a trace. They searched the area, combed through the forest, but there was no sign of me or the mansion. It was as if it had never existed, and maybe, in some ways, it hadn't. Or maybe it was still out there, waiting for its next victim, waiting for someone else to stumble into the trap I had fallen into. But one thing is certain, one NF1 and one tie is still out there, lurking in the shadows, feeding on those who dare to seek him out. And as long as he exists, the nightmare will never truly end. For anyone else who might be reading this, let my story be a warning. There are things on the deep web that should never be found, things that can't be undone once they're set in motion. No matter how tempting the offer, no matter how desperate you are, don't make the same mistake I did, because once you're in, there's no way out, and the price you'll pay is far greater than you can ever imagine. I found a deep web website called The Matrix Attack. It predicted yesterday's Andrew Tate arrest. I've always been a bit of a thrill seeker, not in the typical jump out of airplanes way, but more in the let's see how far down the rabbit hole goes way. The deep web had always fascinated me, with its promise of forbidden knowledge and hidden secrets. I'd read countless stories about it, some probably real, most likely fake, but the allure of it never faded for me. So, one boring Saturday night, I decided to dive in. Now, before you judge me, I'm not completely stupid. I took the necessary precautions. VPN, Tor browser, the whole shebang. I wasn't about to let some basement-dwelling hacker siphon my bank account dry or use my webcam to spy on me. But I was looking for something specific, something that would make the hours of browsing endless black markets and conspiracy forums worth it. That's when I found it. A website called Matrix Attack. It was buried deep within a forum thread, hidden beneath layers of code and cryptic messages. The user who posted the link claimed it was the real deal, but didn't give any details. just a cryptic warning. Don't go looking for things you don't want to find. Of course, that only made me more intrigued. The website itself was nothing special at first glance, just a black background with green text, like something out of an old-school hacker movie. The title at the top simply read, "Matrix Attack, the Truth Exposed." There was no menu, no images, nothing but a single line of text that read, "Enter your query." For a moment, I hesitated. This was different from anything else I'd encountered on the deep web. Most sites were either blatantly illegal or just plain weird. But this felt different. It was like it was waiting for me, almost like it knew I was coming. I typed the first thing that came to mind. What is Matrix Attack? The text flickered, and for a moment I thought the site was about to crash. But then slowly, words began to appear on the screen. The Matrix Attack is the system that controls your reality. It manipulates events, orchestrates chaos, and keeps the truth hidden. You are being watched. You are being controlled. The Matrix Attack is real, and it's happening now. Okay, that was creepy, but it wasn't anything I hadn't heard before. Conspiracy theorists loved to talk about how the system was out to get us, how everything was rigged, blah blah blah. I almost closed the window, but something about the site held me there. I decided to push a little further. Who is behind the Matrix Attack? I typed. Again, the site flickered, and more text appeared. The Matrix Attack is a network. It is not a person. It is not a group. It is everywhere and nowhere. It sees everything. It knows everything. It will destroy anyone who opposes it. At this point, I was rolling my eyes. It sounded like something out of a bad sci-fi movie. But the weird thing was, the more I read, the more I felt this growing unease. It was like the site was seeping into my brain, planting seeds of doubt. But I still wasn't convinced. I needed something more concrete. I took a deep breath and typed out a final question. What will happen tomorrow? This time, the site took longer to respond. The text flickered, vanished, and then reappeared, slowly spelling out each word. Tomorrow, Andrew Tate will be arrested. The Matrix Attack will claim another victim. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. Andrew Tate, the internet personality and former kickboxer who was all over social media. That Andrew Tate. I didn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. It had to be some kind of weird joke. But then I noticed the time at the bottom of my screen. It was already past midnight, which meant that tomorrow was technically today. I tried to shake it off. There was no way this site could actually predict the future. But the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't go away. I ended up staying up all night, refreshing news pages and social media, waiting for something, anything, to happen. By the time the morning rolled around, I was exhausted, barely able to keep my eyes open. But then, around noon, I saw it. A breaking news alert popped up on my phone, and there it was, clear as day. Andrew Tate arrested on charges of human trafficking. My blood ran cold. I stared at the headline, reading and rereading it, hoping that I was just seeing things. But it was real. The site had been right. Somehow, it had known. And that's when I realized that I might have just opened a door that I couldn't close. I didn't know what to do. For hours, I just sat there, staring at my computer screen, trying to process what had just happened. It felt like a bad dream, like any moment I'd wake up and laugh at how ridiculous it all was. But the truth was right in front of me, in black and white. Andrew Tate had been arrested, just like the website said he would be. After the initial shock wore off, I started to question everything. How could a random site on the deep web know something like that? Was it just a lucky guess? But no, this wasn't some vague prediction. It had named a specific person and a specific event, and it had been spot on. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd stumbled onto something I wasn't supposed to see. The rest of that day passed in a blur. I tried to go about my usual routine, but everything felt off. Every time I checked my phone, I half expected another prediction to pop up, but nothing else happened, at least not immediately. The world kept turning, oblivious to the dark corner of the internet I had discovered. At night, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the events of the day, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that website, the green text glowing eerily against the black background. I kept hearing the words, "The Matrix attack is real, and it's happening now." At some point, I must have dozed off because I was jolted awake by a loud banging sound. It was the middle of the night, and for a split second, I couldn't figure out where I was. Then I realized it was coming from the front door. Heart pounding, I got up and crept toward the door, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was just a neighbor, or maybe it was a package being delivered late. But as I got closer, I realized something was wrong. The banging wasn't rhythmic, like someone knocking. It was erratic, like someone or something was trying to break in. I froze, my hand inches from the doorknob. My apartment was dark, and I could barely see a thing, but I could hear the sound clear as day. It was like someone was throwing their entire weight against the door, over and over. Panic set in, and I backed away, grabbing my phone off the coffee table. My first instinct was to call the police, but something stopped me. The words from the website echoed in my head. The Matrix attack will destroy anyone who opposes it. What if this was related? What if whatever was outside was connected to that site? The thought made my blood run cold. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but I knew I wasn't prepared to face it. I turned off all the lights and waited, clutching my phone like a lifeline. The banging continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. Then as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I strained my ears, trying to hear anything. Footsteps, voices, anything. But there was nothing. Just the sound of my own ragged breathing. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place. Eventually, I worked up the nerve to peek through the peephole. I half expected to see someone, or something, standing there, staring back at me, but the hallway was empty. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next day, I was a mess. My mind was racing with 100 different thoughts, none of them good. What if the site wasn't just predicting events? What if it was somehow causing them? The idea seemed crazy, but after what I'd experienced, I wasn't ready to dismiss anything. I needed answers, but I was terrified of what I might find. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back to the site. Maybe there was something I'd missed, some clue about what was really going on. I fired up my computer, taking the same precautions as before, and navigated back to the Matrix attack website. It was still there, exactly as I'd left it. The same black screen, the same green text. But this time, there was a new message waiting for me. Welcome back. The truth is closer than you think. My stomach dropped. It knew I was there. It was like the site was alive, like it was watching me. I wanted to close the window, to pretend I'd never seen any of it, but I couldn't. I needed to know what was going on. With trembling hands, I typed out another question. What do you want? For a long moment, nothing happened. I thought maybe the site had finally crashed, but then slowly, a new line of text appeared. I want you to see. I want you to know the truth. The matrix is breaking, and you are the first to witness its collapse. Watch closely. The next target is already marked. A chill ran down my spine. The next target? I didn't know what it meant, but I had a horrible feeling that someone else was about to suffer the same fate as Andrew Tate. But who? And why? Before I could type another question, the screen went black. The website was gone, replaced by an error message that read, "Connection lost. Please try again later." I slammed my laptop shut, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do, who to turn to. But one thing was clear. This was far from over. I had opened a door to something dark, something that couldn't be unseen. And now, I was in too deep to get out. Whatever the Matrix attack was, it was real. And it was coming for someone else. But who? I spent the rest of the day in a fog, unable to focus on anything except the words I'd seen on that website. The next target is already marked. It felt like a ticking time bomb, and I had no idea when or where it would go off. The thought haunted me, gnawing away at the edges of my mind, making it impossible to think straight. I tried to distract myself, but nothing worked. Every time my phone buzzed with a notification, my heart would jump into my throat, convinced it was another breaking news alert. But it was always something mundane. A text from a friend, an email from work. Life around me was carrying on like normal, completely oblivious to the dark undercurrent I was now aware of. That evening, I got a call from my friend, Jake. We'd been close since college, and he was one of the few people I could talk to about anything. But when I heard his voice on the other end of the line, something felt off. He sounded jittery, nervous, like he was trying to hide something. "Hey man," he said, his voice slightly shaky. I need to talk to you about something weird." My stomach dropped. This was too much of a coincidence. "What's going on?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a long pause on the other end, and when he spoke again, I could tell he was struggling to find the right words. "It's probably nothing," he finally said, "but I've been getting these weird messages. They're anonymous, no number or anything. Just warnings, I guess, telling me to be careful, that I'm being watched." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. "Jake, when did this start?" "A couple days ago," he said. "At first, I thought it was just spam or someone playing a prank, but I don't know, man. It's starting to freak me out." My mind was racing. Could this be connected to the Matrix attack? Was Jake the next target? The idea seemed insane, but after everything I'd seen, I couldn't dismiss it. "Listen to me, Jake," I said, my voice more urgent than I intended. "You need to be careful. There's something going on, something bad, and I think you might be caught up in it." He laughed nervously. "Dude, what are you talking about? You're starting to sound like one of those conspiracy nuts." I wanted to tell him everything about the website, the predictions, the banging on my door, but I couldn't, not over the phone. "Just trust me," I said. "Stay alert. Don't ignore those warnings." Jake hesitated. "Okay, I guess I'll be careful, but you're freaking me out a little, man." "I'm sorry," I said, trying to sound more reassuring. Then I felt. I've got a bad feeling, that's all." We hung up shortly after, and I was left alone with my thoughts. Jake was a skeptic. Always had been. He wasn't the type to believe in anything he couldn't see or touch, and that's what scared me the most. If he was starting to get paranoid, then something was seriously wrong. The rest of the night passed in a blur. I tried to get some sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I pictured Jake's face, twisted with fear, as someone, came for him. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew something terrible was about to happen. The next morning, I called Jake again, but he didn't answer. I texted him, and when I didn't get a reply, I started to panic. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was busy. Maybe he just didn't see my messages. But the feeling of dread wouldn't go away. By midday, I was practically pacing the floor, my anxiety through the roof. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my keys and headed to Jake's apartment. It was only a short drive away, and I figured that seeing him in person would calm my nerves. Maybe he'd just forgotten to charge his phone or something. When I arrived at his place, everything seemed normal. His car was in the driveway, and the lights were on inside. I knocked on the door, trying to keep my cool. There was no answer. I knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. My heart was pounding in my chest as I fumbled for my phone and dialed his number. I pressed my ear to the door, straining to hear any sound, but the phone rang and rang until it went to voicemail. Something was wrong. I could feel it. I tried the doorknob, half expecting it to be locked, but to my surprise, it turned easily in my hand. The door swung open, and I stepped inside, calling out Jake's name. The apartment was eerily quiet. Everything was in its place, neat and orderly, but there was this unsettling feeling in the air, like something had disturbed the space. I walked through the living room, checking every corner, but there was no sign of Jake. When I reached his bedroom, my heart nearly stopped. The bed was unmade, blankets tossed aside like someone had left in a hurry. On the floor, half hidden under the bed, was Jake's phone. The screen was cracked, the casing dented like it had been thrown or dropped. I picked it up, my hands trembling, and tried to turn it on, but it was dead. My mind was racing with possibilities, each one worse than the last. I didn't know what to do, who to call. My first instinct was to call the police, but then I remembered the warnings. The Matrix attack will destroy anyone who opposes it. Was this what had happened to Jake? Had he become another victim of whatever this was? I sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to think. My thoughts were spiraling out of control, fear mixing with guilt. If I hadn't gotten involved with that website, would Jake be safe right now? Was it my fault? As I sat there, something caught my eye. On the nightstand, partially obscured by a stack of books, was a piece of paper. I picked it up, recognizing Jake's handwriting immediately. It was a note, scrawled hastily, like he'd written it in a hurry. If you're reading this, it's too late. They're watching me. I don't know who they are, but they know everything. I can't hide from them. Don't try to find me. Stay away from the Matrix attack. It's real, and it's coming for us all. My blood ran cold. Jake knew. Somehow, he knew what was happening, and he'd tried to warn me. But it was too late. Whatever the Matrix attack was, it had already claimed him. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it all. But there was no sense to be made. Jake was gone, and I was left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of dread. The Matrix attack was real, and now I was caught in its web. There was no turning back. I had to find out the truth, no matter where it led me. But deep down, I knew that the truth might be more terrifying than I could ever imagine. After finding Jake's note, I was paralyzed with fear. Every sound, every shadow seemed like a threat. My mind was screaming at me to leave his apartment, to get as far away as possible, but my legs felt like they were glued to the floor. I knew I should have called the police, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, it would only make things worse. The Matrix attack wasn't something that could be fought with handcuffs and badges. It was something else, something far more insidious. Eventually, I forced myself to leave. I couldn't stay in Jake's apartment any longer, surrounded by his things, knowing that whatever had happened to him could happen to me next. As I stepped out into the hallway, the air felt thick and oppressive, like it was trying to suffocate me. I hurried to my car, my eyes darting around, half expecting to see someone or something watching me from the shadows. The drive home was a blur. My mind was racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them good. Jake was gone, and I had no idea what had taken him or how to stop it. The only thing I knew for certain was that I couldn't trust anyone. If this Matrix attack could reach Jake, it could reach anyone. When I got back to my apartment, I double-checked every lock, closed all the curtains, and turned off every light. I sat in the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to figure out my next move. I was in way over my head, and I knew it, but I couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever had taken Jake to come for me. I needed answers, against every instinct screaming at me to stop. I powered up my laptop and opened Tor. I went back to the Matrix attack site, hoping for some kind of explanation, something that would make sense of the chaos that my life had become. But when the page loaded, it was completely different. Gone was the simple black background with green text. In its place was a live feed, grainy, flickering, like an old security camera. It showed what looked like a basement, dimly lit, with a single metal chair in the center of the room. The chair was empty, but the sight of it sent a chill down my spine. There was something inherently wrong about it, like the room was waiting for something or someone. As I watched, the camera feed flickered, and for a split second, I thought I saw movement in the shadows. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out what it was, but the feed was too grainy, too distorted. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to type, when suddenly the screen went black. For a moment, I thought I'd lost the connection, but then words began to appear, one by one. "You're closer than you think." My heart skipped a beat. I felt like I was being watched, like something was standing right behind me, breathing down my neck. I spun around, but the room was empty, silent, except for the faint hum of my laptop. My pulse was racing, my thoughts spiraling out of control. What did it mean? Closer to what? Before I could type anything, the screen flickered again, and the live feed returned. But this time, the chair wasn't empty. There was someone sitting in it. Jake. He was slumped forward, his head hanging low, his arms limp at his sides. His clothes were torn, and there were dark stains on his shirt that I didn't want to think too hard about. I stared at the screen, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. It couldn't be real. Jake couldn't be sitting in that chair, in that basement, wherever it was. But there he was, right in front of me, unmistakably Jake. I tried to call out to him, even though I knew it was pointless. He couldn't hear me through the screen, but he didn't move, didn't react. He just sat there, like a puppet with its strings cut. My stomach churned with fear and guilt. I should have done something. I should have stopped this before it got this far. And then, as I watched, something moved in the shadows behind Jake. It was just a flicker at first, barely noticeable, but then it grew, slowly taking shape. A figure stepped into the light, tall and impossibly thin, its face hidden beneath a hood. It moved with a slow, deliberate grace, almost like it was gliding. As it approached Jake, my breath caught in my throat. The figure reached out, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. Jake didn't react, didn't even flinch. The figure leaned in close, like it was whispering something in Jake's ear, and as it did, Jake's head slowly lifted. His eyes were wide open, staring straight ahead, but there was something wrong with them. They were empty, hollow, like he wasn't really there anymore. I wanted to scream, to reach through the screen and pull Jake away from that thing, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The figure slowly turned its head, and for the first time, it looked directly into the camera, directly at me. My blood ran cold. It felt like the figure was looking through the screen, through the layers of the internet, right into my soul. Its eyes, or where its eyes should have been, were nothing but dark voids, empty and consuming. And in that moment, I knew that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. The screen flickered again, and the feed went dark. Words appeared, stark and final. "You're next." I slammed the laptop shut, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My entire world had just been turned upside down. Jake was gone, truly gone, and I was next on the list. I didn't know what this thing was, or what it wanted, but I knew one thing for certain. I had to get away. I couldn't stay in my apartment, couldn't stay in the city. I needed to disappear, to go somewhere where this thing couldn't find me. But as I frantically packed a bag, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was already too late. The Matrix attack had already marked me, and there was no escaping it. No matter where I went, it would find me. And when it did, I knew I would end up just like Jake. I left my apartment that night, driving as far as I could without a plan, without a destination. But no matter how far I went, the darkness seemed to follow, creeping closer with every mile. I didn't know where I was going. All I knew was that the end was inevitable, and it was coming for me. I drove for hours, the road stretching out before me like an endless void. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see something following me, that dark figure with its empty eyes closing in. But the highway was empty, the night eerily silent, except for the hum of my engine. The further I went, the more it felt like I was running from something that couldn't be outrun, something that was always just a step behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't have a destination in mind, just an overwhelming need to get away, to put as much distance between myself and that website, that figure, as I could. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. I was marked. Wherever I went, it would follow. The Matrix attack wasn't bound by physical distance or time. It was something else, something far more terrifying. As the night wore on, exhaustion began to creep in. My eyes were heavy, my mind foggy from lack of sleep and the sheer terror of what had happened. I knew I couldn't keep driving forever. Eventually, I'd have to stop. But stopping meant facing whatever was coming for me, and I wasn't ready for that. Not yet. I pulled off the highway into a small deserted rest stop, the kind of place that looked like it hadn't seen a visitor in years. The lights in the parking lot flickered weakly, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the pavement. I parked at the far end, away from the lights, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there in the darkness, gripping the steering wheel, trying to calm the storm of fear and paranoia swirling inside me. I had no plan, no idea what to do next. All I knew was that I couldn't go on like this. I couldn't keep running. I reached for my laptop, hesitating for a moment before opening it. Part of me wanted to throw it out the window, to destroy it, and be done with this nightmare once and for all. But I knew it wouldn't make a difference. The Matrix attack wasn't something you could escape by smashing a piece of hardware. It was everywhere, and I needed answers. When I opened the laptop, the screen lit up, casting an eerie glow inside the car. The connection was weak, but I managed to get back on tour, back to the Matrix attack site. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I thought there would be some kind of clue, some way to end this. But when the page loaded, what I saw made my blood run cold. The live feed was back, but it wasn't the same basement as before. This time, it was showing a different room. My room. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding in my chest. The camera was positioned in the corner, giving a full view of my apartment. The curtains were still drawn, the lights still off, just as I'd left them. But then, the feed flickered, and I saw it. Movement, a shadow passing across the room. I watched, frozen in terror, as the figure stepped into view. The same tall, hooded figure from before, its face still hidden in darkness. It moved slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. It walked across the room, stopping in front of my bed, and then it turned, its head slowly lifting to face the camera. To face me. I couldn't breathe. The figure reached up, pulling back its hood, revealing its face for the first time. But there was nothing there, just a smooth, featureless void, a blank canvas where a face should have been. And yet, I felt its gaze, felt it boring into me, through the screen, through the miles that separated us. The words appeared on the screen again, as if they were being whispered into my mind. You cannot run. You cannot hide. The Matrix attack is everywhere. It sees you. It knows you. And it is already too late. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep hold of the laptop. I wanted to scream, to do anything to break the suffocating silence that surrounded me, but I couldn't. All I could do was sit there, staring at that faceless figure, knowing that it was coming for me, that it was only a matter of time. And then the feed changed again. This time, it wasn't showing my room. It was showing the inside of my car. I jerked my head up, scanning the darkness around me, but I couldn't see anything. The parking lot was still empty, the only movement coming from the flickering lights in the distance. But the camera was inside the car, showing me, sitting there in the driver's seat, staring at the screen. It was like looking into a mirror, but the image was wrong, distorted, like the camera was capturing something that wasn't entirely real. The figure was behind me. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and my entire body went rigid with fear. I didn't want to turn around, didn't want to see what was standing there, but I knew I had no choice. Slowly, I turned my head, the darkness in the car seeming to close in around me. There was nothing there, but I knew that wasn't true. I could feel it, standing just outside the edge of my vision, waiting for me to acknowledge it. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought it might burst, and my hands were slick with sweat as I slowly turned back to the laptop. The live feed was still showing the inside of my car, but now the figure was sitting in the passenger seat, its faceless head turned toward me. It was closer now, so close I could almost feel it, its presence like a cold weight pressing down on me. I couldn't move. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at the screen, at the figure that was somehow both there and not there at the same time. I knew this was the end. There was no escaping the Matrix attack. It had me, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The figure reached out, its hand moving toward me, slow and deliberate. And as it did, the words appeared one final time. "Welcome to the Matrix. You're part of the system now." The screen went black, and in the darkness, I felt the cold hand close around my throat. That's the last thing I remember before everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in a hospital bed, my head pounding, my thoughts muddled. They told me I'd been found at a rest stop, unconscious, with no signs of injury. They said I'd been there for days, but I had no memory of it. No memory of anything after that moment in the car. They asked me what happened, but I couldn't tell them. How could I explain something that defied all logic, all reality? How could I tell them about the Matrix attack, about the faceless figure that had haunted my every step? They wouldn't believe me. No one would. But I know the truth. I know that the Matrix attack is real, that it's out there, waiting, watching, and I know that it's not done with me yet. It's only a matter of time before it comes back, before it finishes what it started. Because once you're marked, there's no escaping it. The Matrix attack always wins. I ordered unexisting car from the future, from the deep web. It's real. Alright, so I'm not really the type to post stuff like this, but I've been carrying this weight around for a while now, and I just need to get it off my chest. You know how sometimes you stumble onto something online that you wish you could just forget? That's exactly what happened to me, except I can't forget. I wish I could, but it's like whatever this is following me. It all started a few months ago. I was bored one night, just mindlessly surfing the web. You know the drill. YouTube videos, Reddit threads, the usual. But somehow, I found myself on a discussion thread about the deep web. Now, I'd heard all the horror stories about the deep web before. Hitmen for hire, illegal substances, human trafficking, but I never thought I'd actually go there. I'm not some thrill seeker or hacker or anything. I'm just a regular guy with too much time on my hands. But curiosity got the better of me. People in the thread were talking about all sorts of crazy stuff. Hidden marketplaces, untraceable currencies, and this one thing that really caught my eye, future tech. Supposedly, there were sites on the deep web where you could buy technology from the future. I know, it sounds insane, and I thought it was just a load of crap, but I kept reading. The deeper I went into the thread, the more intrigued I got. I mean, what if? What if it was real? So, against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. I downloaded Tor, set up a VPN, because I'm not that stupid, and started exploring. At first, it was just what I expected. Sketchy sites selling all sorts of illegal junk. I was about to call it a night when I found a link buried deep in a forum. The text was in some weird language I couldn't read, but the link was labeled in English. Tomorrow's market. I hesitated. Something about it felt off. But then again, everything on the deep web feels off. Right. I clicked the link. The site was simple. Black background, white text, nothing fancy. But it had this weird aura, like I was somewhere I shouldn't be. The homepage was a list of items with bizarre descriptions. Stuff like quantum circuitry and Neuralink devices. It was all super high-tech, futuristic sounding. But then, at the bottom of the page, there was this one item that caught my eye. Prototype vehicle. Delivery guaranteed. No picture, no details. Just a price. $1 million. Yeah, That's a lot of money, but something about it drew me in. I don't even have that kind of money, but the site had this strange option: place on hold. I clicked it without really thinking, and to my surprise, the price dropped. It dropped to $10,000. My heart raced. Still a lot of money, but nowhere near $1 million. And the more I stared at that screen, the more I wanted it. It didn't make sense, but I felt this compulsion to buy it. It's like the site was speaking to me, urging me to take the plunge. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment, I was convinced this car, this non-existent car, was something I needed. I didn't even think about the logistics. I didn't care where it would come from or how it could possibly be delivered. I just clicked buy, and that was it. I didn't even enter any payment details. The screen went black for a moment, and when it came back, there was just a simple message: delivery scheduled. Thank you for your purchase. That's when the real weirdness started. I closed out of everything, shut down my computer, and tried to shake it off. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that car. What was it? Was this all just some elaborate scam? But deep down, I felt it like something was coming. I don't know how else to describe it, but it was like this weight pressing down on my chest. The next morning, I tried to forget about it. I went to work, did my usual routine, but I couldn't get that sight out of my head. It was gnawing at me, this feeling that something was about to happen. And then, just as I was leaving work, I got a text message. Delivery confirmed. ETA 24 hours. No sender, no number, just the message. My heart dropped into my stomach. I hadn't given them my phone number. I hadn't even given them my address. How did they know where to deliver this thing? I should have gone to the cops, or at least told someone. But instead, I just stood there, staring at my phone, frozen. Because deep down, I wanted to see it. I wanted to know what I had gotten myself into. And part of me, a part I'm not proud of, was excited. I went home that night, and for the first time, I noticed how quiet everything was. My house, my street, even the wind. It was all too quiet, like the world was holding its breath, waiting. I barely slept, just lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to happen. When the morning came, I felt like I was losing my mind. I didn't go to work. I just stayed home, pacing around, checking the windows, waiting for I don't know what. I kept checking my phone, but there were no more messages, just that one echoing in my mind. Delivery confirmed. ETA 24 hours. And then, as the sun started to set, I heard it. The sound of an engine outside my house, soft at first, then louder, like it was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I rushed to the window and looked outside. What I saw parked in front of my house made my blood run cold. It was a car, but not like any car I had ever seen before. It was sleek, metallic, and had a strange, almost otherworldly glow to it. There were no markings, no brand, nothing to indicate where it had come from. It just sat there, humming quietly, like it was alive, and it was waiting for me. That's when I realized I had no idea what I had just invited into my life. I stood there, staring out my window at this thing parked in front of my house. It looked like a car, sure, but not one from any manufacturer I'd ever heard of. It had a strange, futuristic design, sleek lines, a low, almost menacing profile, and this eerie, pulsating glow coming from underneath it. The glow wasn't like headlights or any light I had ever seen on a vehicle. It was soft, almost like it was breathing, alive. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. The sun had almost completely set, and the dim light made everything feel even more surreal. There was no sound except for that faint hum coming from the car, like it was calling to me, drawing me closer. I knew I shouldn't go out there. Every instinct I had screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the doors, to call someone, anyone, but I couldn't shake the pull. I needed to see it up close. It's like I was in a trance, moving on autopilot as I grabbed my keys and stepped outside. The air was unnaturally still, not a single breeze, as if the whole world was holding its breath along with me. As I approached the car, I noticed more details that didn't make sense. The surface wasn't like any metal I'd ever seen. It was smooth, almost liquid, and the colors seemed to shift depending on the angle I looked at it from, going from a deep gunmetal gray to a shade that I can only describe as not a color at all, but more like the absence of it. I know it sounds crazy, but that's the best way I can describe it. I reached out, hesitating for just a moment before my fingers made contact with the surface. It was cold, colder than it should have been, almost like touching ice, but not unpleasant. The second I touched it, the car reacted. The hum grew louder, and the glow intensified, spreading across the entire surface like veins lighting up under skin. And then, without me even trying, the door just opened. It slid upward with a soft whoosh, inviting me in. Against every shred of common sense, I found myself stepping inside. The interior was just as bizarre as the outside, sleek and minimal, with no visible controls, just a smooth, featureless dashboard. The seats were made of some material I couldn't identify, soft yet firm, and they seemed to mold perfectly to my body as I sat down. The door closed behind me without a sound, and suddenly I felt completely cut off from the outside world. The interior was silent, dead silent, like I was in a vacuum. For a moment, nothing happened. I sat there, my heart pounding in my chest, waiting for something, anything. Then without warning, the dashboard lit up. Symbols and characters I couldn't understand flickered across it, along with strange fluid patterns that looked almost organic. My stomach dropped as I realized I wasn't in control of this thing. It was in control of me. The car began to move, slowly at first, then faster, smoothly gliding down my street. But here's the thing, my hands weren't on any steering wheel. In fact, there wasn't even a steering wheel to be found. The car was driving itself, and I had no idea where it was taking me. As we sped through the streets, the world outside the windows started to blur. Everything seemed to stretch and distort, like we were moving at impossible speeds, faster than any car should be able to go. My neighborhood, familiar and mundane, began to twist into something unrecognizable. The houses, trees, and streetlights all warped into strange, elongated shapes, their colors bleeding into one another until it was just a smear of light and shadow. My heart pounded in my chest as I fought the urge to scream. But then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car came to a halt. The world outside returned to normal, but we weren't in my neighborhood anymore. We were somewhere else, somewhere I didn't recognize. I was in what looked like an abandoned industrial area. Old factories loomed in the distance, their windows shattered and walls covered in rust and grime. The sky above was an unsettling shade of gray, almost as if it were a perpetual twilight. There was no one around, no signs of life, just a cold, empty silence that seeped into my bones. The car's door opened on its own again, and I stepped out, my legs shaking beneath me. As soon as my feet hit the ground, the car's engine shut off, the lights dimming until it was just a lifeless hunk of metal. Whatever life it had before was gone, leaving me standing alone in this strange, desolate place. I felt a deep, primal fear rising inside me. I didn't know where I was or how to get back. My phone had no signal, and there wasn't a single sound to be heard. No birds, no distant hum of traffic, nothing. Just that eerie, oppressive silence. But what terrified me most was what I saw in the distance. Standing just at the edge of my vision, near the entrance of one of the old factories, was a figure. It was too far away to make out any details, but I could tell it was watching me. My heart skipped a beat as the figure began to move, slowly walking toward me. Every instinct screamed at me to get back in the car, to lock the doors, to get the hell out of there, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. I was paralyzed, caught between fear and an inexplicable sense of dread. The figure got closer, and I could start to make out some details. A tall, thin frame, unnaturally elongated limbs, and a face that seemed wrong, somehow twisted and out of proportion. That's when the car suddenly came back to life. The lights flared on, the engine roared, and without thinking, I jumped back inside, slamming the door shut behind me. The car took off before I could even react, speeding away from that place, from whatever that thing was. The world outside the windows blurred again, colors and shapes twisting into impossible forms as the car rocketed through what felt like a tunnel of light. I don't know how long it lasted, seconds, minutes, maybe even hours, but eventually everything slowed down and the car came to a gentle stop. When I looked out the window, I was back in front of my house. The car door opened and I stumbled out, my legs barely holding me up. The car remained there for a moment, humming softly, as if waiting for something. Then just as suddenly as it had arrived, it vanished. It didn't drive away. It didn't fade out. It just blinked out of existence, leaving me standing there in the middle of my street, alone and shaking. I should have felt relieved, but all I could feel was a deep, sinking dread. Whatever that car was, whatever had happened, I knew it wasn't over. That figure I saw, it was still out there, and somehow I knew it was connected to the car, to the deep web, to everything. But most of all, I knew it was coming for me. I barely remember how I got back inside my house that night. My mind was a blur of confusion and fear, my thoughts racing so fast I couldn't latch onto any of them. All I knew was that I needed to get away from that car, from whatever just happened. But even within the supposed safety of my home, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The house felt different. The once familiar walls and furniture now seemed foreign, distorted, as if I was seeing them through a warped lens. Every shadow seemed darker, every creak of the floorboards more sinister. It was like the air itself had thickened with tension, pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I locked every door, checked every window, but nothing could ease the growing sense of dread that gnawed at me. My mind kept replaying the image of that figure near the factory, the twisted, elongated limbs, the face that didn't seem quite human. The more I thought about it, the more I became convinced that it wasn't just a person. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist in this world. But what terrified me even more was the connection I felt with it. Somehow, I knew that whatever it was tied to the car, to my decision to delve into that cursed part of the internet. And now, it was tied to me. I tried to distract myself, turning on every light in the house, flipping through channels on the TV, but nothing worked. Every sound made me jump, the rustle of leaves outside, the distant rumble of a car passing by, even the ticking of the clock on the wall. I couldn't escape the feeling that something was watching me, just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. It was around midnight when I heard it, the soft thud of footsteps upstairs. My blood ran cold. I knew I was alone in the house, but the sound was unmistakable. Slow, deliberate, moving from room to room. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination, but the footsteps were real. They grew louder, closer, until they were right above me. I grabbed the closest thing I could find, a kitchen knife, and crept up the stairs, each step feeling like it took an eternity. The air was thick with the scent of something metallic, like rust or old blood, and the closer I got to the top, the stronger it became. My hand trembled as I reached the landing, the knife slick with sweat. The footsteps had stopped. The silence was suffocating. I stood there, listening, waiting for whatever was up there to make a move. But nothing happened. Slowly, I made my way down the hallway, checking each room as I went. My breath was shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears as I nudged open the first door. It was my bedroom. Everything looked normal, untouched, just as I'd left it. The bed was still neatly made, the curtains drawn, but the sense of unease was overwhelming. It felt like something had been there, even though there was no sign of it now. I moved on to the next room, a guest room that I hardly ever used. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the hinges protesting against the silence. The room was empty too, but colder than the rest of the house, as if something had sucked all the warmth out of the air. I quickly backed out, pulling the door shut behind me, feeling the walls closing in. There was only one room left, an old storage room at the end of the hall, where I kept random things I didn't need, but couldn't bring myself to throw away. The door was slightly ajar, and a thin sliver of darkness spilled out into the hallway. I stared at it, my mind racing with all the things that could be waiting for me on the other side, but I knew I couldn't just leave it unchecked. I took a deep breath and pushed the door open with the tip of the knife. The room was pitch black, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I reached for the light switch, my hand shaking, and flipped it on. The bulb flickered for a moment, casting strange shadows across the boxes and clutter before finally steadying. The room was empty, just dusty boxes, old furniture, and a thick layer of cobwebs in the corners. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt it, a presence, like something was watching me, hidden just out of sight. My skin prickled with the sensation of eyes on my back, but when I turned, there was nothing there. Nothing but the faint hum of the light bulb above me, and then I noticed it. A smell, faint but unmistakable, like burnt ozone and decayed metal. It was the same smell I had noticed in the car, that strange, unsettling scent that didn't belong in my house. My stomach turned as I realized it was stronger here, more concentrated. I crouched down, knife still in hand, and started moving boxes, desperate to find the source. As I moved one of the boxes, something caught my eye, a small rectangular object hidden beneath a layer of dust. I reached out to touch it, hesitating for just a moment before brushing the dust away. It was a phone, but not like any phone I'd ever seen before. Sleek, featureless, with a metallic sheen that reminded me too much of the car's surface. It was cold to the touch, unnaturally cold, and as I picked it up, the screen flickered to life. The display was filled with symbols and characters, the same ones I'd seen on the car's dashboard. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what this meant, Whatever was in that car had left this behind. But how? And more importantly, why? My hands shook as I tried to make sense of the symbols, but they were like nothing I'd ever seen, shifting and changing as I stared at them, almost as if they were alive. Suddenly, the phone vibrated in my hand, and a new message appeared on the screen. This one was in English, and it was simple, but it made my blood run cold. I'm closer than you think. My breath caught in my throat. I dropped the phone like it had burned me, stumbling back into the hallway. The footsteps started again, louder this time, echoing through the walls, but they weren't coming from upstairs anymore. They were all around me, moving through the house, shifting from one place to another, as if something was stalking me, just beyond the edges of my vision. Panic took over. I raced down the stairs, my heart pounding, the knife still clutched in my hand. I knew I had to get out of the house, but as I reached the front door, I stopped dead in my tracks. There, on the other side of the door, I saw it, the same figure I had seen at the factory, standing in the shadows, its twisted form barely visible through the frosted glass. Its hand reached for the doorknob, moving slowly, deliberately, as if it knew I was watching. I backed away, my chest tight with fear, and looked around for another way out. The back door. If I could just make it to the back door, I could escape, maybe find someone, anyone who could help me. But as I turned, I realized the footsteps had stopped. The house was silent again, too silent, like the very walls were holding their breath. I moved as quickly and quietly as I could, slipping through the kitchen and toward the back door. My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to unlock it, and just as I yanked it open, I heard a whisper. It was soft, barely audible, but it cut through the silence like a knife. You can't run. I froze, my blood turning to ice soon. The voice was coming from behind me, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. But when I turned, there was no one there, just empty space and that awful, suffocating silence. I bolted. I ran out the back door, through the yard, and into the night, not stopping until I reached the street. My lungs burned. My legs felt like they were going to give out, but I didn't stop. I kept running, away from my house, away from whatever had taken hold of my life. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay there. Eventually, I found myself in a small park, empty and deserted at this hour. I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath, my mind reeling. What the hell was happening? What had I gotten myself into? I didn't have any answers, just more questions and a growing fear that there was no way out of this. But one thing was clear. I wasn't dealing with something human. And wherever that car had come from, whatever that figure was, it was far from over. I could feel it, deep in my bones. This was only the beginning. Sitting on that bench, my lungs burning from the run, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched. The park was eerily quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, making you acutely aware of every breath, every heartbeat. The trees loomed tall and dark, their branches swaying gently, even though there wasn't a breeze. It felt like the shadows themselves were alive, shifting and closing in on me. I tried to calm myself, to think rationally, but my mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle of what was happening. It all started with that damned deep web purchase, the car that shouldn't exist, and now this. I kept going over the events in my head, trying to find some logic, some explanation, but there was none. I was in way over my head, dealing with something that defied all reason. I pulled out my phone, half expecting it to be dead, or worse, to show me some twisted message, like the one on that strange device I'd found. But the screen lit up, showing the time, 2:47 a.m., and a full signal bar. For a moment, I felt a wave of relief, as if seeing something normal, something mundane, could anchor me back to reality. But that relief was short-lived. As I stared at the phone, I noticed something off. The battery percentage was draining rapidly, plummeting from 67% to 40% in a matter of seconds. Then it dropped to 20%, then 10%. I frantically swiped through the settings, but nothing made sense. The phone was being drained of power right before my eyes, like something was feeding off it. And then it died. The screen went black, and I was plunged back into that oppressive silence. I cursed under my breath, shoving the dead phone into my pocket, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of dread growing inside me. I needed to get a grip. I needed to figure out what to do next. But before I could form a plan, I heard it. A low, droning hum, like the one I'd heard from the car. Except this time, it was coming from somewhere above me. I looked up, squinting into the darkness, and my breath caught in my throat. Something was hovering in the sky above the park. It was hard to make out its shape, but it was large, dark, and almost completely silent, except for that low hum. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, almost like it was gliding on the air rather than flying. My first thought was a drone, but this thing was too big, too strange. And then, as if sensing my gaze, it began to descend. Panic surged through me, and I scrambled off the bench, backing away as the thing lowered itself toward the ground. It didn't touch down. Instead, it hovered a few feet above the grass, pulsating with that same eerie glow I'd seen on the car. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the strange object as it hung in the air, humming softly. Then, without warning, it projected a beam of light onto the ground in front of me. The light was intense, almost blinding, and I had to shield my eyes. When I dared to look again, I saw something forming within the beam. Shapes, figures, shifting and solidifying as if they were being constructed out of the very air. I watched in horror as 3 figures emerged from the light, their forms tall and thin, their faces obscured by dark, featureless masks. They were humanoid, but there was something wrong about them, something that made my skin crawl. Their limbs were too long, their movements too smooth, like they were puppets on invisible strings. They didn't speak, didn't make a sound, but I could feel them staring at me, those blank faces turned in my direction. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but I was paralyzed with fear. One of the figures stepped forward, raising a hand in a slow, deliberate motion. In its grasp was something small and metallic, something that glinted in the dim light. My mind was racing, trying to comprehend what it was holding, when it tossed the object toward me. It landed with a soft thud at my feet, and I looked down to see keys, car keys, attached to a small, sleek fob that matched the design of the vehicle I'd seen earlier. I stared at the keys, my mind reeling. They couldn't be real. None of this could be real. But there they were, lying on the ground, as if waiting for me to pick them up. The figure stood motionless, its hand still outstretched, as if offering me a choice: take the keys or face whatever was coming next. My survival instinct finally kicked in. I snatched the keys off the ground, my hand trembling as I held them. The second I did, the figures turned in unison, moving back toward the beam of light. They faded, dissolving into the air as if they had never been there, leaving me alone in the dark once more. The object hovering above me began to rise, its hum growing fainter as it ascended into the night sky. Within moments, it was gone, leaving no trace that it had ever been there. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rapid pounding of my heart. I was left standing there, clutching the keys in my hand, unsure of what to do. Part of me wanted to throw them away, to get rid of anything connected to that car, to whatever dark force had invaded my life. But another part of me knew that wasn't an option. I was in too deep, and whatever this was, it wasn't going to let me go that easily. With a sinking feeling in my gut, I realized I had to go back to where it all started, back to my house, where that car had appeared, and where the nightmare had begun. As I made my way through the empty streets, the keys clutched tightly in my hand. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was walking into a trap, that whatever had started this was far from over. And the worst part, I knew I had no choice. The shadows, the strange figures, the car, all of it was converging on one point, and that point was me. By the time I reached my house, the sky was starting to lighten with the first hints of dawn, but instead of bringing relief, the pale light only made everything feel more surreal. My house stood there, silent and still, just as I had left it, but I knew better. I knew something was waiting for me inside. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar scent of my home now tainted with that same metallic burnt smell. I stepped inside, the keys heavy in my pocket, and took a deep breath. Whatever happened next, I had to face it. There was no running, no hiding, not anymore. As I moved through the house, I could feel the air growing colder, denser, as if something was pressing down on me from all sides. Every shadow seemed to twist and writhe, shifting just out of the corner of my eye. And then, from somewhere deep within the house, I heard it. A voice, faint, distorted, like it was coming from a great distance, but unmistakable. "You should never have found us." The words sent a chill down my spine, freezing me in place. It was the same voice I had heard before, the same whisper that had haunted me, but now it was clearer, more defined, and it was coming from the living room. I forced myself to move, to follow the sound, even though every instinct screamed at me to turn back. The door to the living room was slightly ajar, and as I approached, I could see a faint glow coming from within, that same strange light I had seen before. My hand shook as I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, but the air was thick with that unnatural energy, like the walls themselves were vibrating with it. And there, in the center of the room, floating just above the coffee table, was the car fob, its metallic surface glinting in the pale light. As I stared at it, the voice came again, louder this time, filling the room with its presence. "You belong to us now." The fob pulsed with light, and the water around me began to twist and warp, just like it had when I was in the car. The walls stretched, the ceiling seemed to close in, and the floor beneath my feet started to dissolve into nothingness. I was being pulled into something, some dark, otherworldly place where the rules of reality no longer applied. I tried to fight it, tried to hold onto something, anything, but it was no use. The darkness swallowed me, the last remnants of my world slipping away as I was dragged into the abyss. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. I was standing outside again, in front of my house, the early morning sun casting long shadows across the lawn. The fob was still in my hand, cold and unyielding, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. I knew that something had changed, that whatever I had been pulled into had left its mark on me. The street was quiet, the world going about its business as if nothing had happened. But I knew that I was no longer part of that world. I was connected to something else now, something that was beyond my understanding, and it wasn't going to let me go. As I stood there, staring at the fob in my hand, I realized that there was no going back. The car, the figures, the strange events, they were all part of something much larger, something that I had only begun to uncover. And whatever it was far from finished with me. I felt a cold shiver run down my spine as the realization sank in. This was only the beginning. The nightmare was far from over. The sun had fully risen by the time I found the strength to move. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the car fob in my hand, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was a tangle of fear and confusion, but beneath it all, there was a growing sense of inevitability. Whatever this was, it wasn't going to stop until it had what it wanted. And deep down, I knew what I had to do. With a heavy heart, I walked back to where it all began, the spot where the car had first appeared. The street was empty, the world around me eerily still. The birds weren't singing, and there was no wind to rustle the trees. It was as if the entire neighborhood had fallen under a spell, held captive by the same dark force that had taken hold of my life. I reached the spot and stopped, the fob clutched tightly in my hand. My heart pounded in my chest as I raised the fob, pressing the button with a trembling finger. For a moment, nothing happened. The world remained silent and still, and I wondered if maybe, just maybe, it was over. But then I heard it, the low hum of the engine, growing louder with each passing second. The air seemed to vibrate with it, and the same strange glow began to fill the street, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. I watched in disbelief as the car materialized before my eyes, as if it had always been there, waiting just out of sight. It was exactly as I remembered it, sleek, metallic, with that otherworldly glow pulsating beneath its surface. The door opened on its own, the interior beckoning me with its unnatural silence. I knew what it wanted. I knew what I had to do. With a deep breath, I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a soft click, sealing me inside the car's eerie, soundless cocoon. The dashboard lit up, the same strange symbols and characters flashing across it. My hands gripped the sides of the seat, my knuckles white with tension as the car began to move. It was like before, no steering wheel, no controls, just a smooth, unstoppable glide as the car drove itself. But this time, there was no blur of colors, no distortion of the world outside. Instead, the car took me down familiar streets, past the houses and landmarks of my neighborhood. But everything looked wrong. The colors were off, too bright or too dull, like a poorly developed photograph. The buildings were twisted, their angles unnatural, as if the world had been reshaped by something that didn't fully understand how it should look. As we drove, I saw people, neighbors, strangers, all walking down the streets or standing in their yards, but their faces were blank, featureless, like mannequins. They didn't seem to notice the car as it passed by, didn't react at all. It was as if they were frozen in time, trapped in some twisted version of reality. My heart pounded in my chest, a cold sweat breaking out across my forehead. I had no idea where the car was taking me, but I knew it wasn't anywhere good. The road ahead stretched on endlessly, disappearing into a thick, swirling fog that seemed to swallow everything in its path. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the car came to a stop. The fog parted, revealing a massive structure in the distance, an impossibly tall tower, its surface a smooth, reflective black that seemed to absorb all light. It rose into the sky, vanishing into the clouds above, its presence looming and oppressive. The car's door opened, and I knew I was supposed to get out. I stepped onto the ground, my legs shaky beneath me. The air was thick with that same metallic burnt smell, and the hum of the car faded into the background as I walked toward the tower. Each step felt like it took an eternity, the ground beneath me shifting and undulating like a living thing, but I couldn't stop. Something was drawing me closer, pulling me in like a moth to a flame. As I reached the base of the tower, a door slid open with a hiss, revealing a narrow corridor bathed in dim, flickering light. The walls were smooth, featureless, and the air was colder here, sharp and biting. I hesitated for just a moment before stepping inside, the door closing behind me with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in impossible ways. The deeper I went, the more the walls began to change, shifting from smooth metal to something organic, almost fleshy, like I was walking through the inside of a living creature. The air grew thicker, the light dimmer, until I was barely able to see more than a few feet ahead of me. And then, just as I felt like I couldn't go any further, I emerged into a vast, open chamber. The walls of the chamber were lined with screens, each one flickering with images and symbols that made my head spin. In the center of the room stood a massive structure, a machine of some sort, humming with energy, and standing before it was the figure, the same one I had seen near the factory, the same one that had appeared at my door. It was taller now, more defined, its limbs unnaturally long, its face still hidden behind that featureless mask. The figure turned to face me, and I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me. I wanted to run, to escape, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure raised one hand, and the machine behind it began to pulse with light, the hum growing louder until it was all I could hear, vibrating through my bones. And then, the figure spoke, not with words, but directly into my mind, a voice that was both cold and familiar. "You have been chosen." I didn't understand, didn't know what it meant, but the words filled me with a deep, primal fear. The machine's light grew brighter, enveloping me in its glow, and I felt myself being lifted off the ground, pulled toward it by an invisible force. My body was weightless, my mind filled with a cacophony of images and sounds, none of it making any sense. The last thing I saw before everything went white was the figure, its mask shifting, revealing a face that was neither human nor machine, but something far older, far more terrifying. It stared at me with eyes that seemed to see through me into the very core of my being, and in that moment, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about the car, the deep web, or even the strange events that had led me here. This was something much larger, something that had been set in motion long before I ever stumbled upon that cursed site. And now, I was part of it, a piece in a game I couldn't begin to understand. The light consumed me, and everything went dark. I don't know how much time passed after that. Minutes, hours, days. When I finally awoke, I was lying in my bed, in my house, everything just as it had been before. The sun was shining through the window, birds were singing outside, and the world seemed normal again. But I knew better. I got out of bed, my body heavy with the weight of what had happened. The memories were fragmented, disjointed, but they were there, lingering at the edges of my mind like a bad dream I couldn't shake. I looked around the room, half expecting to see something out of place, something to remind me of the nightmare I had lived through. And then I saw it. Sitting on the nightstand, glinting in the morning light, was the fob. The same sleek, metallic fob that had led me down this dark path. I reached out to touch it, my hand trembling, and the moment my fingers brushed against it, a shock of cold shot through me, freezing me to the core. The fob hummed softly, the same hum I had heard from the car, from the machine, from everything. It was still with me, still connected to me, and I knew without a doubt that the deed was far from over, because now I was part of it, and there was no escape. The end